If you have a Bible with you today and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Matthew chapter 5. This is where we'll be spending our time in Sunday school today. And as we do this today, I want us to keep a couple of things in mind. Now, I look in this room and I know that there are people in this room today who are dealing with things in their lives, whether physical, in their bodies, or in their home, wherein when Jesus calls us to do and to be certain things, that this calling that he gives is difficult for us in some ways. As a matter of fact, he says in Matthew 11, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." Well, I wonder if when Jesus calls us to do and be what he calls us to do and be, if we really look at it that way. Is the difficulty in what Jesus is calling us to do and be, or is the difficulty in us and our ability to respond to it? Let's take a look at the text here today. I'll begin reading in verse 13. "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty once again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled. You're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a lampstand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before everyone, that they will see your good deeds and praise your Father who is in heaven." Now, this text comes to us in a way that is different from the way it would come to those in the first century. Yes, we all know about salt, and we know that it adds flavor. We also still today use it to preserve meats and fish. You go to the store and you buy beef jerky. It's a salt preserved bit of beef, or whatever it is you're buying as jerky. In Italy today, you can go and buy these hams, some of which have been hanging in this building that the air just comes through at room temperature. Whatever the outside air is, that's the air that's around the hams. Some of them have been hanging there for years. They were salted down, and now they are curing in this building, and they keep track of how many years they've been hanging by where they are in the building. You can buy these hams today. They're extraordinarily expensive, but they've been preserved by nothing more than salt. So salt has this quality. Well, in the first century, these people that were listening to Jesus would have heard this idea of salt in a very different way. For them, salt was extraordinarily valuable. They had no other way to preserve meat or fish or poultry of any kind. They could not preserve any kind of animal meat in any way except to salt it down. So for them, it was an extremely valuable commodity. Now, it was used also as a condiment for flavor as well. But it was so valuable. The Roman soldiers at this time in history, when Jesus speaks this word, they were paid something called a salarium. A salarium. You know what that was? It was a portion of salt. It's the word from which we get our word salary. That's how valuable it was. Plutarch, the Greco-Roman historian, said of salt, he said that it had a divine quality. It was as though it had come from the gods, he said, because it took meat that was dead and kept it from dying any further. So when these people listen to Jesus give this little metaphor regarding salt, they're hearing this in a very specific way. So salt as a condiment and salt as a preservative. Now, as he makes the metaphor applicable to them, he makes it applicable to us. The metaphor holds true for us as well. We are in this fallen world, and all around us the world is rotting, is it not? Right, it is. We come into it, and we are supposed to be a preserving element. Now, you probably have had experiences like this. I can relate this experience of my own in seeing this happen. I was a very new Christian when I was working in Maryland. As a matter of fact, Maryland is the place, in Annapolis. I was working on a bridge project as a carpenter diver. And I became a Christian while I was in Maryland. And so I'd only been a Christian for a little while, but on this job of 220 odd men, it was all men, that I was the only Christian, and everybody knew it. When I became a Christian, it was widely known amongst all the other workers that Rip Snow is one of those born-againers. That's how they referred to me. Well, in the wintertime, people who do that kind of work generally come to work far before time to go to work, because it's just nice to go hang out. You get up really early, you eat your breakfast, you drive into work, and there's really nothing to do for anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes before work time at 7, and so we would just hang out. Well, in the wintertime, it's just too cold. As a matter of fact, the winter that I was there was the coldest winter they'd had in 100 years, so nobody was hanging out outside. They would go into the office trailer and hang out in there because it was heated. But the funniest thing, after I became a Christian, I would come into the office trailer when all these men would be having very colorful conversations about women mostly. And when I came in the room, the conversations died. Now they might start back up, but there was something that was happening just because I was coming into the room. I was having a preservative effect on these guys in that room. I was salt. I was too young a Christian to know anything. I didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't doing this consciously. But I was being salt in that moment. Believers in this world, we expect, I think we should, to help people around us who are not believers to find it easier to live more moral lives. Now, secondly, salt also brings a flavor to things. This is where sometimes believers, followers of Jesus, fall a little short. C.S. Lewis makes a really good analogy regarding salt and what we are to be in this world. He says, imagine you were introduced to someone from another planet who'd never heard of salt. And so they come and you talk to them about cuisine on your planet, and you explain to them that most of the cooking is done with salt. And so the person from another planet says, well, I'd like to taste some of that. So you give them a little bit of salt, and they taste it, and they say, my gosh, that's a powerful flavor. Why, if you use this in all your cooking, all your food's going to taste like that. But you explain it to them that, no, that's not the case. When you use the right amount of it, it becomes something that brings the flavor out. I don't know if you've ever eaten green beans or eggs or things like that with no salt whatsoever. They don't taste very good. But you put a little salt on them, and all of a sudden the flavor that's there comes out. It's pretty amazing. Well, that's the way we're supposed to be in the world also. But it's not always like that for us. And look, I don't want to make too much of this because, as I've said in the past to you all, we will never outworld the world. That'll never happen. If we're going to follow Jesus, there are going to be some parts of the party that we just can't join in with. And so we're going to be looked at in some ways as perhaps not as exciting as those who can join the party. This came to the forefront actually in the 4th century. Constantine, as you know, in the 4th century in Rome, declared Christianity to be the religion of the Roman Empire. It became the faith of the empire. That's awesome. Few emperors later, we had Julian who came along, Julian the Apostate, he's called. He's called that for a reason. He thought it would be nice to reinstitute the paganism of the Roman past. But there was a reason he wanted to reinstitute it. Do you know what that reason was? He looked at the Christians and said, you are bland, insipid, and not appreciative of the good things of the earth. So he wanted to bring back the paganism. Christianity didn't look like it was any fun to him. Now, as I've said, we can't outworld the world, but there's one thing for sure. We are not to be so flat and lifeless that nobody wants to be part of what we are. There's a different kind of life. You know, the scripture uses 2 words for life in the Greek. One is bios, which bios, we know what that is. The bios is the carcass. But the other word is zohes. Zohes is a different kind of life. It's the spiritual life, the kind of life that Jesus had after his resurrection. That kind of life we are to have. Jesus said it to us. I come to give you life and life abundant. That word there is not bios. That word there is zoes. A different kind of life. And it's supposed to show. And that goes to Jesus' next analogy here. The lamp and the lampstand. Now this again does not quite capture for us what it captured for them. In the first century in Palestine, the houses were very, very small. And in the rural areas, of course, there are no city lights. There are no city lights really anywhere, although in some of the larger cities they would burn torches at night. But out in the countryside, there's nothing. So when it's dark, it's dark. And at night, imagine you're in this small Palestinian home. Everybody in the household practically sleeps in one room. So you might have 6, 8 people sleeping on the floor in this one room. Now imagine that you have to get up to relieve yourself in the middle of the night. What are you going to do? You don't have a flashlight, and you can't be bothered to light the lamp. There's no matches. So you kept the lamp burning at night, all night. And this lamp would sit on a lampstand in the middle of the room, light the room just enough that everybody in the room could see. So if you got up, you could see to step around people, that you could go outside and relieve yourself. Or whatever it was that happened to happen. Maybe you couldn't sleep that night, but you wouldn't wake everybody up. That's what Jesus means. It puts light out into the whole room where everyone can see. That's the imagery. And he's sarcastic in the way in which he presents this. He says, nobody lights a lamp and puts it under a bowl. That's the way he would have said that, because for them, this imagery would have made perfect sense. But you see, again, the analogy still holds for us. You and I are to be a light in this world. Now sometimes that light that we are gets us into trouble because we run afoul. You know, Jesus talked about it too. He said some people prefer the dark. Right? They do. And when we bring light into that dark, it's not always appreciated by those whom we illumine with who we are. Remember that song we used to sing in Sunday school in the primers? This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. That's exactly what it's referring to. It's referring to that fact that we are to be the light of the world. It's a high calling. Now, in being salt and light, we come back to that initial question that I set before you, which is, we're called to be salt and light, but is that really an easy yoke and a light burden for you and me? Sometimes it's not. I remember when, and this is just how weak I am, just to relate that to you. I'm no tower of fortitude when it comes to being light and salt and light. I'm not. I remember when we had our child and he was a baby. Every parent in this room can relate to this, I guess. Maybe some of you generationally didn't do this as men, but in my generation we did. And that is, you took care of the baby at night, right? So, and I was in a unique situation in that my wife had postpartum depression, and so she wasn't able to take care of him at night. So what does that mean? Well, that means you go to sleep when he goes to sleep, which might be at 7 o'clock at night. You'll try to go to sleep, and you're going to be awake in an hour and a half because it's time to eat. And that goes on all night, every hour and a half. You might get 40 or 50 minutes of sleep between the feedings. Maybe. Well, when I was doing that, and then getting up the next morning and going to work, that didn't seem like a easy yoke or a light burden to me at all. Now, extrapolate from that as to what it means to be salt and light in some dangerous places in this world. I have some missionary friends, as you well know, who are missionaries in Muslim countries. When they send me an email, they send me the email and say, do not resend this email. Do not resend this email. because they don't want anybody on the internet to happen across it who's not part of their email chain and to find out where they are and what they're doing, because they could be imprisoned or killed. And they've got a family there as well. So you can see where being salt and light in some places is extremely costly. Could it be? You know, Paul said something to us very significant in this idea of being salt and light. He said, if you want to worship God, this is how you do it. You present yourself as a living sacrifice. That's your holy and acceptable spiritual service of worship. Wow. You know, we come to church like this today, and we call this the worship of God. Well, this is a tiny, think about this, 2 hours, a tiny little sliver of our normative living out there in the world every day, where we're called to be salt and light. It's easy to be salt and light in here. Everybody in here is real salty and real light, lit up. But out there it's very different, isn't it? Maybe we don't understand what it is that constitutes the true worship of God in this world as salt and light. Maybe we're harboring improper expectations of what life should be. Now, look, to follow Jesus in this world is not without incentive. It has an incentive. What is the incentive? Well, Paul gives it to us pretty clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. He says there's a reward. And I'll be the first to say I'm conscious of that reward, aren't you? I look around this fallen world and I think, gee whiz, this is not a great place for a follower of Jesus right now. It doesn't seem that way to me. And to think about that reward of being with the Lord forever, whatever that's going to be. I don't know exactly what it's going to be like, but I know it's going to be good. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, nor has it entered in anybody's mind what that's going to be like. But it's going to be good. And some of the things in this world as we are here today, they don't look quite so good. So I'm looking forward to that. And you know, the older I get, the more I look forward to it. But if we have an expectation that following Jesus to be salt and light here in this world is just going to be something as an enhancement for us, we might have a wrong expectation of it. I remember so many things happen when we become born again, don't they? I mean, I remember a friend of ours sitting right here in this pew up front here saying one day, I didn't know how much sin was in my life until I became a believer. In other words, I could do all kinds of things before I became a believer. Once I became a believer, I looked bad. So sin has a kind of a preeminence once we become believers, in that we're conscious now of these things that beforehand we had no awareness of. It's like Paul says, I didn't know what coveting was until the law told me, do not covet. And then all of a sudden, covetousness was awakened in me. Well, it's kind of like that for us. And so in some ways, think about it, we are the first thing that gets salted down and lit up when we become born again. But then we're left here, aren't we, to do something, and that's to continue to be salt and light for some others. Now, there's a problem in some minds here, and I want to speak to this just a moment from this text. In being salt and light, the way Jesus talks about it here, it sounds grand, but it's really not. It's small. It's incremental. It's in the tiny places of living. And when we think about it the way it really is, sometimes we can become overcome by what I would call crisis exhaustion. I was at a meeting the other day, and some friends of mine in our association had said we need to call a meeting. You know, about 100 churches in our association. Did you know that? In our denomination. They said we need to have a meeting. It's a called meeting. That means there's something that's emergent that needs to be met about. So I went to the meeting, and it was to do with the fact that in the western part of our state, Hurricane Michael has destroyed tens of thousands of homes and hundreds of churches in another association. And what our association is doing now is planning to coordinate to be an aid to that association. We're going to send teams of people over to work on that. And as you know, I work as my day gig in home remodeling, and of course the people in the association know that as well. And I'm thinking to myself, they're probably thinking, here goes, is this a good spot for Rip to go over and start to help? And immediately, it was almost like I could taste it. I was overwhelmed. I just thought, what am I going to do? Tens of thousands of houses? I could take some ladders over there and fix a few roofs or spread a few tarps or whatever. But it's a drop in the bucket compared to the need. And then I think about, this is why I don't watch news anymore too much. Go home and watch the news and you see all these refugees streaming in from Syria. Did you know that a lot of those refugees streaming in from Syria are believers? They are followers of Jesus. There's a large Christian population in Syria. And so these are brothers and sisters who are streaming in. They've lost everything. They're just happy to have their children with them. And now they're going to take their children, no schools, no facilities. They're going to go live in a tent in a refugee camp while the world feeds them out of the goodness of the world's heart and part of what we do. It seems overwhelming. And it can seem to us like this being salt and light in the smallest areas of living doesn't matter very much. I saw this little fable, and I'm going to relate it to you. It really helped me a lot in thinking of this properly. And it's very logical, too. The fable makes a great point. The fable goes this way. There was a sparrow sitting on a limb in the winter, one winter's day. And all of a sudden, it started to snow. And the sparrow thought, I wonder how much a snowflake weighs. Well, there was a limb right across from it. And it started to collect snowflakes, and the sparrow started to count the flakes. So it sat there counting and counting and counting. And then there was a crow in another tree watching the sparrow count these snowflakes. And the crow thought to himself, I wonder what he's doing. So the crow flew down and lit on the limb wherein the snowflakes were collecting that the sparrow was counting. The crow says, what are you doing? Sparrow says, I'm counting these snowflakes. And it had slowed down now, so there was a little time between the flakes. And the crow said, why would you want to do that? I mean, why would you want to count snowflakes? What purpose is there? How much does a snowflake weigh that it matters that you're counting it? Sparrow said, well, I want to see how many flakes it takes before the limb gives way and breaks. And the crow says, a snowflake weighs nothing. You're wasting your time. And just about then, one flake came down and hit the limb where the snow had been collecting, and the crow was now perched, and the limb and the crow and the snow broke away and went to the ground. One more flake. It matters what we do. Everything we do in the kingdom of God, wherein we attempt to be salt and light in this fallen world, matters. Everything. There is nothing. I remember reading this incredible quote from somebody who's a great statesperson, Henry Kissinger. Great statesperson, understands foreign policy, understands all of the interactions between governments. And he said this, and I love this quote. He said, we who work in statescraft work as though we will achieve a permanent world peace, but we know we will not. Is that not a great picture for being salt and light in this world? That we would work toward being salt and light to the fullest, to saving this world from its rot, to bringing light into the world such that people can see and that they might see Jesus because of us. Will we save the whole world from its rot? We will not. But we work as though we can. This is so opposite from the way some people look at the world. Some people look at the world as believers, as followers of Jesus, that it's something to be insulated from. That's the whole reason for the monastic movement in Christianity, which started very early on. People felt as though they were just so sickened by the rot that they had to pull themselves out of it and sequester themselves in a place where there would be no rot, where all they had to do all day was contemplate and pray and study and learn. But that's not the picture Jesus paints at all, is it? No. Jesus paints a picture where we go into this messy world and we bring that purifying factor of our saltiness to save it from its, to slow the rot. We bring our saltiness in to bring a winsome attraction to who we are, because we as human beings should be the fullest of human beings, should we not? Should not a Christian, a person who has the Spirit of God living in them, be the most human being there is? We're complete in a way that someone who doesn't know Jesus is not complete. And then we're to bring light to open people's eyes to the fact that there's a better way. There's a way to live in harmony with God instead of as God's enemy. What's missing for us a lot is two things. One, we don't understand what it is to be a witness. You know, the word that's translated witness in the New Testament is the word martyrion. You know where we get our word martyr? Right there. That's what it is to be a witness, a martyr. And secondly, we come at this process sometimes so poorly. Julian the Apostate wasn't too far off the mark in some ways. We come at this, one of the harshest accusations we get as believers, and you all know this, right? Two things. You're a hypocrite and you're what? Self-righteous. That's right. Self-righteous. Why is that? Unfortunately, we kind of are sometimes. But if we come at this being salt and light with the right attitude, that will never be an accusation that can be properly leveled. You know why? Jesus said to us in the same text, the same talk, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." What does he mean by that? Look, all we have to stand before God with is the mercy that's been given us because we asked for it, because of what Jesus did. And that is the only difference between us and anybody else who walks this earth. We don't have any claim to anything other than we came to God and asked for mercy, and he gave it. A repentant heart is poor in spirit, and our hearts should be permanently repentant. That's how we remain salty. That's how the saltiness remains. That's how we can remain as an attraction to people. Hebrews chapter 11 gives us something very interesting to think about. I want to read a little of this, if I could, just to set this tone for us as we look at this today. The writer says in verse 1 of chapter 11, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen is not made out of what is visible. By faith Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith he still speaks even though Abel is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he didn't experience death. He could not be found, for God had taken him away. And before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because everyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Now, this text, as you know, goes on to list all of these people for whom faith drove them forward and for whom most didn't live to see the promise on this earth. In fact, all of them. They didn't see the promise on this earth fulfilled. And then he closes that with this in chapter 12. Now just think about that. All those people lived their lives. That picture of Abel making the sacrifice that God was good with, he liked. Because of what? Because of what it was? No, because of his heart condition as he brought that sacrifice. And by faith, he's dead, but he is still salt and light for you and me. Think about what it means. And this is why they did it. Chapter 12. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, Let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. That's why we want to be salt and light, because we can look ahead, you see, and recognize that this world, I can give of myself, you can give of yourself to be salt and light in this fallen world, in every realm of living. When we leave this place, and it means giving up our lives in some way, right? Sometimes to be salt and light is hard. But it doesn't matter, because we're looking ahead to a kingdom that cannot be shaken, one we'll never have to worry about. So, as you and I go forward in this month, I want us to commit to a couple of things if we could. Number one, when we leave this place today, after the church service and everybody goes out the door, I want us to commit to find areas in our lives, in our homes, with our spouses, our children, our relatives, the cashier at Walmart, the gas station attendant behind the glass, whatever it is, that we will commit to be salt and light. And then in the coming weeks, whoever's willing, I will ask us to testify as to what our experiences were as we attempted to be salt and light. Let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you so much for this. Thank you for the lessons you give. Thank you that you're patient with us, Lord, and that you allow us to be salt and light, but you allow us to learn to be salt and light as a disciple. Please take this day, Lord, and make it what you would have it to be. Make it all it can be. Make us salt and light. We thank you, Lord, for all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.